Australia, officially the Commonwealth of Australia, is a country comprising the mainland of the Australian continent, the island of Tasmania, and numerous smaller islands. It is the world's sixth largest country by total area. Neighbouring countries include Papua New Guinea, Indonesia and East Timor to the north, the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu to the northeast, and New Zealand to the southeast. For about 50,000 years before the first British settlement in the late 18th century, Australia was inhabited by indigenous Australians, who spoke languages grouped into roughly 250 language groups. After the European discovery of the continent by Dutch explorers in 1606, Australia's eastern half was claimed by Great Britain in 1770 and initially settled through penal transportation to the colony of New South Wales. From the 26th of January 1788, the population grew steadily in subsequent decades. The continent was explored and an additional 5 self-governing crown colonies were established. On the 1st of January 1901, the 6 colonies federated, forming the Commonwealth of Australia. Since federation, Australia has maintained a stable liberal democratic political system that functions as a federal parliamentary constitutional monarchy comprising 6 states and several territories. The population of 24 million is highly urbanized and heavily concentrated in the eastern states and on the coast. Australia is a developed country and one of the wealthiest in the world, with the world's 12th largest economy. In 2014, Australia had the world's 5th highest per capita income. Australia's military expenditure is the world's 13th largest, with the 2nd highest human development index globally. Australia ranks highly in many international comparisons of national performance, such as quality of life, health, education, economic freedom, and the protection of civil liberties and political rights. Australia is a member of the United Nations, G20, Commonwealth of Nations, ANZ, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, World Trade Organization, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and the Pacific Islands Forum. Name: the name Australia is derived from the Latin terra australis, a name used for putative lands in the southern hemisphere since ancient times. The earliest recorded use of the word Australia in English was in 1625 in a Note of Australia del Espiritu Santo, written by Sir Richard Hakluyt, published by Samuel Purchas in Hakluytis Posthumus, a corruption of the original Spanish name Australia del Espiritu Santo for an island in Vanuatu. The Dutch adjectival form Australica was used in a Dutch book in Batavia in 1638 to refer to the newly discovered lands to the south. The first time that the name Australia appears to have been officially used was in a dispatch to Lord Bathurst of 4 April 1817, in which Governor Lachlan Macquarie acknowledges the receipt of Matthew Flinders' Charts of Australia. On 12 December 1817, Macquarie recommended to the Colonial Office that it be formally adopted. In 1824, the Admiralty agreed that the continent should be known officially as Australia. History. Prehistory. Human habitation of the Australian continent is estimated to have begun between 42,000 and 48,000 years ago, possibly with the migration of people by land bridges and short sea crossings from what is now Southeast Asia. These first inhabitants may have been ancestors of modern indigenous Australians. At the time of European settlement in the late 18th century, most indigenous Australians were hunter-gatherers, with a complex oral culture and spiritual values based on reverence for the land and a belief in the dream time. The Torres Strait Islanders, ethnically Melanesian, were originally horticulturists and hunter-gatherers. The northern coasts and waters of Australia were visited sporadically by fishermen from maritime Southeast Asia. European arrival. The first recorded European sighting of the Australian mainland, and the first recorded European landfall on the Australian continent, are attributed to the Dutch navigator Willem Janssen. He sighted the coast of Cape York Peninsula in early 1606, and made landfall on the 26th of February at the Pennefather River near the modern town of Weipa on Cape York. The Dutch charted the whole of the western and northern coastlines and named the island continent New Holland during the 17th century, but made no attempt at settlement. William Dampier, an English explorer and privateer, landed on the northwest coast of New Holland in 1688 and again in 1699 on a return trip. In 1770, James Cook sailed along and mapped the east coast, which he named New South Wales, and claimed for Great Britain. With the loss of its American colonies in 1783, the British government sent a fleet of ships, the First Fleet, under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip, to establish a new penal colony in New South Wales. A camp was set up and the flag raised at Sydney Cove, Port Jackson, on the 26th of January 1788, a date which became Australia's National Day, Australia Day. Although the British Crown colony of New South Wales was not formally promulgated until the 7th of February 1788. The first settlement led to the foundation of Sydney, and the exploration and settlement of other regions. A British settlement was established in Van Diemen's Land, now known as Tasmania, in 1803, and it became a separate colony in 1825. The United Kingdom formally claimed the western part of Western Australia in 1828. Separate colonies were carved from parts of New South Wales, South Australia in 1836, Victoria in 1851, and Queensland in 1859. The Northern Territory was founded in 1911 when it was excised from South Australia. South Australia was founded as a free province. It was never a penal colony. Victoria and Western Australia were also founded free, but later accepted transported convicts. A campaign by the settlers of New South Wales led to the end of convict transportation to that colony. The last convict ship arrived in 1848. The indigenous population, estimated to have been between 750,000 and 1 million in 1788, declined for 150 years following settlement, mainly due to infectious disease. Thousands more died as a result of frontier conflict with settlers. A government policy of assimilation, beginning with the Aboriginal Protection Act 1869, resulted in the removal of many Aboriginal children from the families and communities, often referred to as the stolen generations, a practice which may also have contributed to the decline in the indigenous population. The federal government gained the power to make laws with respect to Aborigines following the 1967 referendum. Traditional ownership of land, Aboriginal title, was not recognized until 1992, when the High Court case Mabo v Queensland overturned the legal doctrine that Australia had been terra nullius before the European occupation. Colonial expansion. A gold rush began in Australia in the early 1850s, and the Eureka Rebellion against mining licence fees in 1854 was an early expression of civil disobedience. Between 1855 and 1890, the 6 colonies individually gained responsible government, managing most of their own affairs while remaining part of the British Empire. The Colonial Office in London retained control control of some matters, notably foreign affairs, defense, and international shipping. Nationhood on 1 January 1901, Federation of the Colonies was achieved after a decade of planning, consultation and voting. This established the Commonwealth of Australia as a dominion of the British Empire. The Federal Capital Territory was formed in 1911 as the location for the future federal capital of Canberra. Melbourne was the temporary seat of government from 1901 to 1927 while Canberra was being constructed. The Northern Territory was transferred from the control of the South Australian government to the Federal Parliament in 1911. In 1914, Australia joined Britain in fighting World War I, with support from both the outgoing Commonwealth Liberal Party and the incoming Australian Labor Party. Australians took part in many of the major battles fought on the Western Front. Of about 416,000 who served, about 60,000 were killed and another 152,000 were wounded. Many Australians regard the defeat of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps at Gallipoli as the birth of the nation, its first major military action. The Kokoda Track Campaign is regarded by many as an analogous nation-defining event during World War II. Britain's Statute of Westminster 1931 formally ended most of the constitutional links between Australia and the UK. Australia adopted it in 1942, but it was backdated to 1939 to confirm the validity of legislation passed by the Australian Parliament during World War II. The shock of the United Kingdom's defeat in Asia in 1942 and the threat of Japanese invasion caused Australia to turn to the United States as a new ally and protector. Since 1951, Australia has been a formal military ally of the US under the ANZ-US Treaty. After World War II, Australia encouraged immigration from Europe. Since the 1970s and following the abolition of the White Australia policy, immigration from Asia and elsewhere was also promoted. As a result, Australia's demography, culture, and self-image were transformed. The final constitutional ties between Australia and the UK were severed with the passing of the Australia Act 1986, ending any British role in the government of the Australian states, and closing the option of judicial appeals to the Privy Council in London. In a 1999 referendum, 55% of voters and a majority in every state rejected a proposal to become a republic with a president appointed by a two-thirds vote in both houses of the Australian Parliament. Since the election of the Whitlam government in 1972, there has been an increasing focus in foreign policy on ties with other Pacific Rim nations, while maintaining close ties with Australia's traditional allies and trading partners. Government. Australia is a federal parliamentary constitutional monarchy with Elizabeth II at its apex as the Queen of Australia, a role that is distinct from her position as monarch of the other Commonwealth realms. The Queen is represented in Australia by the Governor-General at the federal level and by the governors at the state level, who by convention act on the advice of her ministers. The most notable exercise to date of the Governor-General's reserve powers outside the Prime Minister's request was the dismissal of the Whitlam government in the constitutional crisis of 1975. The federal government is separated into three branches: the legislature, the bicameral parliament defined in Section 1 of the Constitution as comprising the Queen, the Senate, and the House of Representatives; the executive, the Federal Executive Council, which in practice gives legal effect to the decisions of the Cabinet, comprising the Prime Minister and Ministers of State who advise the Governor-General; the judiciary, the High Court of Australia and other federal courts, whose judges are appointed by the Governor-General on advice of the Federal Executive Council. In the Senate, there are 76 senators, 12 each from the states and 2 each from the mainland territories. The House of Representatives has 150 members elected from single-member electoral divisions, commonly known as electorates or seats, allocated to states on the basis of population, with each original state guaranteed a minimum of 5 seats. Elections for both chambers are normally held every 3 years simultaneously. Senators have overlapping 6-year terms except for those from the territories, whose terms are not fixed but tied to the electoral cycle for the lower house. Thus only 40 of the 76 places in the Senate are put to each election unless the cycle is interrupted by double dissolution. Australia's electoral system uses preferential voting for all lower house elections with the exception of Tasmania and the Act which, along with the Senate and most state upper houses, combine it with proportional representation in a system known as the single transferable vote. Voting is compulsory for all enrolled citizens 18 years and over in every jurisdiction, as is enrollment. The party with majority support in the House of Representatives forms the government and its leader becomes Prime Minister. In cases where no party has majority support, the Governor-General has the constitutional power to appoint the Prime Minister and, if necessary, dismiss one that has lost the confidence of Parliament. There are two major political groups that usually form government, federally and in the states: the Australian Labor Party and the Coalition, which is a formal grouping of the Liberal Party and its minor partner, the National Party. Within Australian political culture, the Coalition is considered centre-right and the Labor Party is considered centre-left. Independent members and several minor parties have achieved representation in Australian parliaments, mostly in upper houses. The most recent federal election was held on the 7th of September 2013 and resulted in a majority government for the Coalition. Liberal Party leader Tony Abbott was sworn into office as Prime Minister by the Governor-General of Australia on the 18th of September. In September 2015, Malcolm Turnbull successfully challenged Abbott for leadership of the Coalition, and was sworn in as the 29th Prime Minister of Australia. States and territories. Australia has 6 states: New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria and Western Australia, and 2 major mainland territories, the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory. In most respects these 2 territories function as states, but the Commonwealth Parliament can override any legislation of the parliaments. By contrast, federal legislation overrides state legislation only in areas that are set out in Section 51 of the Australian Constitution. State parliaments retain all residual legislative powers, including those over schools, state police, the state judiciary, roads, public transport and local government, since these do not fall under the provisions listed in Section 51. Each state and major mainland territory has its own parliament, unicameral in the Northern Territory, the Act and Queensland, and bicameral in the other states. The states are sovereign entities, although subject to certain powers of the Commonwealth as defined by the Constitution. The lower houses are known as the Legislative Assembly. The upper houses are known as the Legislative Council. The head of the government in each state is the Premier and in each territory the Chief Minister. The Queen is represented in each state by a Governor, and in the Northern Territory, the Administrator. In the Commonwealth, the Queen's representative is the Governor-General. The federal parliament directly administers the following territories: Ashmore and Cartier Islands, Australian Antarctic Territory, Christmas Island, Cocos Islands, Coral Sea Islands, Heard Island and McDonald Islands, Jervis Bay Territory, a naval base and seaport for the national capital inland that was formerly part of New South Wales. The external territory of Norfolk Island previously exercised considerable autonomy under the Norfolk Island Act 1979 through its own legislative assembly and an administrator to represent the Queen. In 2015, the Commonwealth Parliament abolished self-government, integrating Norfolk Island into the Australian tax and welfare systems and replacing its legislative assembly with a council. Macquarie Island is administered by Tasmania, and Lord Howe Island by New South Wales. Foreign relations and military. Over recent decades, Australia's foreign relations have been driven by a close association with the United States through the ANZ-US Pact, and by a desire to develop relationships with Asia and the Pacific, particularly through ASEAN and the Pacific Islands Forum. In 2005, Australia secured an inaugural seat at the East Asia Summit following its accession to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia, and in 2011 attended the 6th East Asia Summit in Indonesia. Australia is a member of the Commonwealth of Nations, in which the Commonwealth heads of government meetings provide the main forum for cooperation. Australia has pursued the cause of international trade liberalisation. It led the formation of the Cairns Group and Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. Australia is a member of the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development and the World Trade Organization, and has pursued several major bilateral free trade agreements. Most recently the Australia-United States Free Trade Agreement and closer economic relations with New Zealand, with another free trade agreement being negotiated with China, the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement, and Japan, South Korea in 2011, Australia-Chile Free Trade Agreement, and as of November 2015 has put the Trans-Pacific Partnership before Parliament for ratification, along with New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Malaysia and Singapore. Australia is party to the Five Power Defence Arrangements, a regional defence agreement, a founding member country of the United Nations. Australia is strongly committed to multilateralism and maintains an international aid program under which some 60 countries receive assistance. The 2005-06 budget provides $2.5 billion for development assistance. Australia ranks 15th overall in the Centre for Global Development's 2012 Commitment to Development Index. Australia's armed forces, the Australian Defence Force, comprise the Royal Australian Navy, the Australian Army and the Royal Australian Air Force, in total numbering 81,214 personnel as of November 2015. The titular role of Commander-in-Chief is vested in the Governor-General, who appoints a Chief of the Defence Force from one of the armed services on the advice of the government. Day-to-day force operations are under the command of the Chief, while broader administration and the formulation of defence policy is undertaken by the Minister and Department of Defence. In the 2015-16 budget, defence spending was $31.9 billion, or 1.92% of GDP, representing the 13th largest defence budget. Australia has been involved in UN and regional peacekeeping, disaster relief and armed conflict, including the 2003 invasion of Iraq. It currently has deployed about 2,241 personnel in varying capacities to 12 international operations in areas, including Iraq and Afghanistan. Geography and climate. Australia's land mass of 7,617,930 square kilometres is on the Indo-Australian Plate, surrounded by the Indian and Pacific Oceans. It is separated from Asia by the Arafura and Timor Seas, with the Coral Sea lying off the Queensland coast, and the Tasman Sea lying between Australia and New Zealand. The world's smallest continent and sixth largest largest country by total area. Australia, owing to its size and isolation, is often dubbed the island continent, and is sometimes considered the world's largest island. Australia has 34,218 kilometres of coastline, and claims an extensive exclusive economic zone of 18,148,250 square kilometres. This exclusive economic zone does not include the Australian Antarctic Territory. Apart from Macquarie Island, Australia lies between latitudes 9 degrees and 44 degrees south, and longitudes 112 degrees and 154 degrees east. The Great Barrier Reef, the world's largest coral reef, lies a short distance off the northeast coast and extends for over 2,000 kilometers. Mount Augustus, claimed to be the world's largest monolith, is located in Western Australia, at 2,228 meters. Mount Kosciuszko on the Great Dividing Range is the highest mountain on the Australian mainland. Even taller are Mawson Peak, on the remote Australian territory of Heard Island, and, in the Australian Antarctic Territory, Mount McClintock and Mount Menzies, at 3,492 metres and 3,355 metres respectively. Australia's size gives it a wide variety of landscapes, with tropical rainforests in the northeast, mountain ranges in the southeast, southwest and east, and dry desert in the center. It is the flattest continent, with the oldest and least fertile soils. Desert of semi-arid land, commonly known as the outback, makes up by far the largest portion of land. The driest inhabited continent. Its annual rainfall averaged over continental area is less than 500 millimeters. The population density, 2.8 inhabitants per square kilometer, is among the lowest in the world. Although a large proportion of the population lives along the temperate southeastern coastline, eastern Australia is marked by the Great Dividing Range, which runs parallel to the coast of Queensland, New South Wales and much of Victoria. The name is not strictly accurate, because parts of the range consist of low hills, and the highlands are typically no more than 1,600 meters in height. The coastal uplands and a belt of brick-low grasslands lie between the coast and the mountains, while inland of the Dividing Range are large areas of grassland. These include the western plains of New South Wales, and the Ennersley Uplands, Barkly Tableland, and Mulga lands of inland Queensland. The northernmost point of the east coast is the tropical rainforested Cape York Peninsula. The landscapes of the top end and the Gulf country, with the tropical climate, include forest, woodland, wetland, grassland, rainforest and desert. At the northwest corner of the continent are the sandstone cliffs and gorges of the Kimberley, and below that the Pilbara. To the south of these and inland, lie more areas of grassland, the Ord Victoria Plain and the Western Australian mulga shrublands. At the heart of the country are the uplands of Central Australia. Prominent features of the centre and south include Uluru, the famous sandstone monolith, and the inland Simpson, Tarari and Stoney, Gibson, Great Sandy, Tanami, and Great Victoria deserts, with the famous Nullarbor Plain on the southern coast. The climate of Australia is significantly influenced by ocean currents, including the Indian Ocean Dipole and the El Niño Southern Oscillation, which is correlated with periodic drought, and the seasonal tropical low-pressure system that produces cyclones in northern Australia. These factors cause rainfall to vary markedly from year to year. Much of the northern part of the country has a tropical, predominantly summer rainfall climate. The southwest corner of the country has a Mediterranean climate. Much of the southeast is temperate.